Now, what we're seeing happening today, the government labels all those who are taking part in the riots as far right. Some of them, I guess most of them are actually. Although I think some of them actually don't even have really thought out any ideologies, they're just doing it because that's what they feel like. But there's a growing number of people who don't take part in riots, but who are also saying enough is enough when it comes to mass migration and multiculturalism. Now, you can't keep bringing the population the size of Nottingham into the country every year and expect everything to work out smoothly. You can't keep bringing in people with different values and cultures from our own, hope to integrate them and provide them without doing damage to the people who've lived here for generations. And we have to say that most people, or many people, are getting fed up with it. Now, this point is totally lacking in the response of the government. Watch Keir Starmer and Yvette Cooper coming on TV with somewhat robotic speeches condemning right-wing thuggery and threatening draconian prison sentences, but also showing a total inability to understand the problem. And the new Labour government's actually going to have to recognise there's a growing resentment to the preferential treatment which is being given sometimes to new immigrants over the settled population, particularly amongst people whose natural constituents, the white working class in northern towns and cities. People see their culture, way of life being constantly put down. It's hard to find housing, especially for young people, while migrants are often given housing straight away. Sometimes white people find themselves discriminated against in job opportunities which have quotas favouring non-whites over white applicants. All these things are building up a huge resentment. And beyond this, you can see that in this new order, the established British culture, backed by respect for Christianity and the Bible, has to take second place to the cultures of other lands which have no traditional association with these islands. We see a continual doing down of British history and culture, with left-wing dogmas being imposed upon us, including the critical race theory and the cancel culture. This has become part of the Marxist agenda to change the values of our society, and is actually imposing a new form of totalitarianism, which seeks to control what we can say and think and believe. It's rejecting traditional British culture and seeking to make all white people feel guilty because of past slavery and racism in our history. Incidentally, it also fails to recognise the role British Christians played in bringing slavery to an end, and it never condemns the role that Arab Muslims played in black African slavery. Of course, we are totally against slavery. It was wrong. But actually, I'm not responsible for it. It happened 200 years ago. But there is modern slavery taking place, including forced labour, debt bondage, forced marriage, human trafficking, and various forms of slavery, which you find are generally located in Muslim and African countries and cultures, and nobody speaks out against them. Critical race theory has nothing to say about it. And the reason actually so many people want to come to the UK is because of our tradition of generosity and tolerance, and to escape from oppressive and violent regimes in countries of the Africa and the Middle East. Now, if you look at the present situation, you can see that the Labour government has been in power for a month, and from the way these things are going, it looks like they're going to continue to move further down the route of imposing this kind of way of thinking upon us. And this is also backed by a controlling influence which has now been established over much of the media, the BBC in particular, the education system, the universities in particular, the judiciary and the police, the civil service and much of the established church and charities and NGOs. Ironically, the takeover of our institutions has increased during the 14 years of the supposedly right-wing Tory rule, though it has to be said that one of the reasons for the collapse of the Conservative Party in the last election was the surrender they made to so much of the change agenda during their time in power, causing people who don't like this to vote for reform, which was one reason that Labour got such a huge majority, though it only won 20% of the votes of people eligible to vote. But now that Labour has got a huge majority in Parliament, it looks like there's no way out of this process for at least 5 years or longer, by which time it may be over for all of us. People don't want to feel alienated and resentful. They see much of our culture, our cities, and our way of life being trashed, but they've got no power to do anything about it. And the result of this is going to be an increase in violence and extremism, leading to the civil strife we are now seeing taking place. That's not to justify violence, certainly not, or civil strife. But unless the government takes steps to address the root causes of the problem, there's going to be no end of it. Going back to Melanie Phillips in her article, she says, what's driving people absolutely wild is the double standards that are on such display. The Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, speaks as if the only problem is right-wing thuggery. Certainly that problem has been shockingly evident and should be dealt with, but so should Muslim and left-wing thuggery. There have been numerous examples during these riots of Muslim thugs gratuitously attacking white people, yet Starmer never calls these people thugs. At some of the anti-Israel demonstrations, you've heard Muslims saying, Kaiba, Kaiba al-Yahud. I remember already mentioned this, but that's saying death to the Jews, basically, because it's going back to what Muhammad did. So you've got this, people saying these things, and yet they don't get censored, and they carry on with it. Going back to what Melanie says, it's a profound sense of injustice and double standards that has finally ignited the already combustible public resentment over race and immigration and enabled neo-fascists and other agitators to exploit the situation. Starmer's strictures against right-wing thugs are in stark contrast to the solidarity expressed with the Black Lives Matter, anti-police, anti-West, anti-white rioters in 2020, who destroyed poor neighborhoods in Portland, Oregon, and other places in the US, and to whom he actually took the knee and proudly tweeted his picture doing that. In other words, he agreed with it. You should note that the Black Lives Matter riots that Starmer and the far left approved of caused violence and massive destruction of property in America, led to the defund the police movement, which left poor inner city communities at the mercy of gangsters and criminals, and led to the current situation of lawlessness and chaos in many of America's great cities. Also led to a kind of reverse anti-white racism. Going back to Melanie Phillips, she said, liberal commentators tolerate demonstrators screaming for jihad, the destruction of Israel, the murder of Jews on the weekly pro-Gaza hate marches, the harassment and intimidation perpetuated by many demonstrators, and the calls on these marches for the mass murder of Jews and the destruction of Israel are all against the law, yet with few exceptions have been relatively no police action against them. We can surely predict what will now unfold. Mass, uncontrolled immigration will continue, with increasing collapse of social cohesion, escalating Muslim demands and intimidation, and yet more double standards and demonization of critics. This will create a further backlash which will include serious anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim violence. The government will continue to enforce a one-eyed approach acknowledging only such white violence while ignoring legitimate public concerns. The issue of Muslim anti-Semitism at eye-watering levels, but already hard to discuss without being smeared as an Islamophobe, will become unmentionable. With the media and other liberals in sanctimonious support, Muslims will increasingly wrap themselves in the mantle of victimhood and insist upon draconian moves against Islamophobia. This will lead to increasing crackdown on anyone trying to draw attention to these issues and be used by the Starmer government as a useful weapon to silence its political foes. The social disaster underway is owned by the West entitled liberals whose arrogant disdain for the culture they have so willfully ruined knows no bounds. That's end quote from Melanie Phillips. So I'll give you some of my comments. From what we can see, the response so far suggests the government will move in the direction of imposing control through further clampdowns on the opposition. Already there are plans to bring in laws on Islamophobia, which may prohibit us from saying critical things of Islamic belief or practice. Now, if you go out and talk to Muslims, especially to Muslim preachers, outreach workers who you find sometimes on the streets, go down to Leicester Square, they're down there every day almost, handing out Qurans to people going by. Go down to Speaker's Corner, as some of you do, you'll find them there preaching their message. You'll soon find that they attack Christianity in their outreach programs. You'll find them attacking basic Christian beliefs about the deity of Jesus, the meaning of his death and resurrection. You may also find them teaching horrible things about the Jews and calling for their eradication on pro-Palestine, anti-Israel demos. You also hear of radical imams in Birmingham and elsewhere calling for Sharia law to be imposed on Muslim areas, and basically saying that non-Muslims should clear out of these areas if they don't like it. So this is, you can see, is heading for a huge crisis in the society. Now, we're willing to defend our faith and discuss these issues with Muslims, but in the process we also need to point out the errors in Islam. Question then is, will we be faced with death threats from the radical Muslims? Will we be forbidden to defend our faith and expose the errors in the Quran and in basic Muslim texts, as well as protest against Muslim persecution of Christians, support of violent terrorism, oppression of women, and intolerance towards non-Muslims living in their midst? Will we be able to give out booklets like, as Quran or the Bible, which one has the authentic message? Tells you that the Bible does, and gives you some answers to what is wrong in the Quran. Could say that that's Islamophobic because it's saying what's wrong with Islam. Now, we have a situation which is clearly very dangerous. And the current unrest and violence by far right-wing groups is no help in defending our right to keep our way of life and defend our faith. In fact, it's damaging to it. Could be the way in which we lose more of our basic freedoms in a growing control by the government, labelling all opposition as illegal and far-right and racist. Reminded that in 1933, the Nazis used the burning of the Reichstag, the parliament building in Berlin, to suppress the communist opposition and all opposition in the early years of Hitler's power. So they could use the riots, the opposition, and say, now we're going to suppress you and we're going to take away your freedoms. We use this unrest to bring a greater degree of control upon us. And end up allowing only one ideology to be preached, theirs, and to continue to put down biblical culture, history, values, and Christian faith. I would say this is already happening. We're seeing a new establishment taking control of our institutions, pushing them in the left diversity agenda on everything that's going on in our society. They have control over significant influence in most of our institutions. As I've said, the TV media, BBC, Sky News, and also foreign paper news like CNN, Euronews, Reuters, and also the universities, the judiciary, the police, and even the church. And people who hold competing views, especially what could be even moderate right-wing views, and nationalist views, and biblical Christian views, who want to uphold traditional moral values and oppose the woke agenda, find themselves being pushed out and silenced in favour of the multinational, multiracial, multicultural, multi-faith agenda. You can also see that this Labour government will be more willing to submit to elements of the Muslim agenda which threaten our freedom and our future. I watched an interview with which Keir Starmer was talking to the London Mayor, Sadiq Khan, of course is a Muslim, and basically Starmer was really praising Islam and saying how wonderful it is and what a great contribution it makes to our society. I have to say that many Muslims do make a good contribution to our society. I'm not against all Muslims, and I recognise that many Muslims are very helpful. I've been in hospital and been treated by Muslim doctors who are very kind and very competent. But they also see there is an agenda with the radical Muslims to change our society, which is definitely to be resisted. Now, in this talk with Sadiq Khan, he requested Starmer to use his position and legal experience to push for an extension of the laws on Islamophobia. If they do this, it could end up, as I've said already, with us not being able to make critical statements about the Muslim religion and the Quran. We also find that Starmer has appointed Shabana Mahmood, a Muslim woman, as the Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice. In other words, she's the high point in our justice system now. She's also been on the pre-Palestine rallies and clearly supports Gaza over Israel. I guess that's natural as a Muslim. But to have a Muslim in charge of our justice system is very concerning, especially as they move towards laws on Islamophobia. On the subject of Israel, we find that after the October 7th massacre of Jews, Keir Starmer and the new, who was then and is now the Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, took a moderately sympathetic position on Israel, but as time's gone on, they become more and more critical as the Gaza war continues. They're now cutting off arms supplies to Israel as Israel faces the threat of a genocidal war against its people from the Islamists surrounding it. David Lammy said he supports the ICC ruling to arrest Netanyahu for war crimes, and we can expect them to come under more pressure on this issue from anti-Israel influences in Parliament. Labour is also making plans to bring us closer union with the EU to undo Brexit without actually joining the EU. They've scrapped the Rwanda plan but put nothing in its place, so now refugees lining up to cross the Channel believe they'll get a good deal from Labour, and we won't be, when they do come, as they are coming in great numbers, we won't be able to house them or feed them or employ them, but we won't be able to stop them coming.